Okay. And we're continuing from last week. Last week we had good discussion, and I think I had a lot of stuff planned, and so we only got through part of it. So the handouts are the same as they were last week. So if everybody has them, we can begin. Let me do my share screen. Become here. Dun, dun. Let's see if I got the right one. Yeah, we talked about, the whole series is on what we believe and why we believe it. Okay. And I got started on the Bible and then I keep expanding it. We'll probably go through a good part of October talking about how we got the Bible, what the Bible means. Next week, we're going to talk about what's the purpose of the Bible. Why do we even have Bibles? If God could talk to the prophets without a book, why can't he talk to us without a book? Those kind of things. And also how to read the Bible. Most people get stuck because they want to just, I better read my Bible. And they just open it up somewhere. Usually at the first page, table of contents, and then start working their way through. You get past Genesis and maybe halfway through Exodus. I mean, it's some hard travels going through that. And people are getting into Leviticus and they're done. No, it is. So you can't do that. But we'll get into that. And then we'll get into good reasons to trust the Bible, because that's a big thing that people throw up at, Christians is how can you believe this? Or what about all the contradictions? Or what about all the mistakes? Or, whatever it is. So we'll go through that. But so let me see. So I'm just going to flash through some of these just as a reminder.
But Gene, real quick, if you put that in the King James version, you're right.
That's right, because
ESV, it makes it.
Well, but see, the thing is, a lot of people with the King James, they go, if it was good enough for the Apostle Paul, it's good enough for me. Well, to bring that up, because we will talk today about translations, but the thing is about the King James is that it was the English Bible for 400 years. Man, you can't even get a Bible to be the current Bible for 4 years anymore before another translation comes out. I don't know how many of you, but all my memory verses were in King James English. That's just the way you did it. The hymns were written in King James English. And now there's flaws in the King James because the language isn't the same. Some of the manuscripts, they've found better manuscripts, since then. But anyway, so we had talked about avenues of, we talked about revelation, general revelation, just being able to look at creation and say, I know there's a God, but it doesn't get you any further than that. Doesn't tell you who God is or really much about him. We talked about special revelation, and that would be like the Bible. And we talked about different avenues of revelation, the casting of the lots, the Urim and Thummim, dreams, visions, theophanies, God appearing in human form to people, and through the prophets and angels, just different ways that God has communicated himself, to us. We'd kind of left off at words used in connection with inspiration. And the thing is that the inspiration of the whole Bible is important because people would like to say, well, yeah, the ideas in the Bible are inspired by God, but the words aren't inspired by God. The prophets or the apostles or whoever's doing the writing, they were inspired to write about the stuff, And so that's where we got verbal and plenary. Verbal means the words. We say it's inspired in the words. Then people will say, yeah, but not all the words. Then we go verbal plenary. Plenary means all the words. Plenary means full. Just all the words are inspired. Okay, and then we got infallible, which applies to the total accuracy of the Bible. Because even though the words may be inspired, what does it mean when Bible talks on science? Or when the Bible talks on, I don't know, whatever, history, landmarks. You know, when it says, and then we went from this city to this city, can we trust it? It really meant this city and this city. And inerrancy applies to everything in the Bible. I mean, we're talking from table of contents to maps. No, probably not quite that far, but all the books in between those things. So, just want to flash through this. Okay, we talked a little bit about this one. Let me move this over so it's not so big there. You know that it was originally written on stone, on clay, on leather. And the point that I made about this last week was that's how important the Bible was to get the words written down. And I think I teased about that. How many of you ever carved your memoirs into stone? You don't do you? I would. I'd write a love letter to my wife, but if I have to carve it in stone, that's too much work. But these people, these people did that. So then it went to papyrus, which is a plant. So you get these leaves of plants, you dry them out, you sew them together, and then that's what, those like scrolls are made of that. Scrolls are whatever material they're made of, they're just pieces of that sewn together and wrapped up. So here's scrolls, which was the next thing on there. So you got scrolls, and then it gets into codex. Anybody know what a codex is? Codex is like the first book form. Instead of having the scrolls, they kept the paper flat, sewed the papers together, and you can see the bottom one there. It's kind of like a book. Like that. So made it easier to carry, and to transport and to use. I mean, obviously, Pastor Callio's got a John Grisham book back there. Well, it's a lot easier to read out of the book than it is if I had the John Grisham scroll and I had to keep on scrolling, Oh gosh, I'm only on chapter 3. I got to keep, so these things are for ease. Pardon?
Unless you had an auto scroll and just push the button.
Well, that's what you have on your computer, isn't it? Where it just scrolls while you're reading something. You set the speed for it to flash before your eyes. Then they got into animal skins because animal skins were more durable. See, we have no original copies of any Bible, of any book of the Bible, of any page of the Bible, because the materials that they were all written on disintegrate. So we don't have any originals. So as I get into trying to get to better materials, I don't know if that was their thought. It was probably animal skins were more available. Were you
Like the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls were, you got to remember that if you're talking about, well, let me try to do it this way. Dead Sea Scrolls weren't the originals. They were what they were using in that day. So it'd be like if we took Pastor Callio's John Grisham book and we said, this book's going to be valuable someday, or somebody's going to come and try to censor us and burn books or whatever. We're going to bury them. And I do have a big John Grisham library at home. I'm going to bury all my John Grisham books in a cave just to protect them so that either I know where they are or people, following me will have them so that there'll be a record of them. And then say 1,000 years go by, someone's digging around a cave here in Lake Havasu City and says, look what I found. I found all these books from way back, and these must be valuable. And that's where those came from. The value of the Dead Sea Scrolls was that they were written probably, I'm going to say 800, 900, 1000. Am I a genius or what? They call it 1,000 now?
Yeah.
When did that start? But they were written well after the originals were written, but that's what they were using of the day, and then they got hidden. But what they found is that what it said in, say, the scroll of Isaiah, that was said year 1000, I'll use Joe's terminology, if that, in the year 1000 matched what they'd found later of Isaiah that was in 200 BC. And you go, wow, they must have really spent a lot of time copying this correctly. And that's what we count on, is how it was transmitted down through history and the accuracy. Since we don't have, and we'll get into that a little bit more this morning. So,
Gene,
who gened?
me?
Yeah,
So your example with Grisham, put him in the cave, all one author. And it's important for us that the Bible is all one author with different writers. We're
Right.
kind of inspired by God, so God's the one.
I'll
author.
bury it with my collection of 60 Perry Mason books. Then people will know. Then it's no, that is right. And we'll get into like the various, writings and stuff like that. When we get into good reasons to trust the Bible, Ray.
Was the Torah that Moses wrote, the first 5 books of the Bible, were they enhanced as time went
Were they
on?
what?
Were they enhanced, or is that all that they had back then and that they have now?
Well, there's a question, and I just say what other people say, okay? Is that the question becomes, well, when were the books of Moses written? Did Moses write them? Or were they written during the times of the kings? Because, David and Solomon and the priestly tribes or priestly classes that ruled at that time, did they write them? And I mean, we believe that Moses wrote them.
Yeah,
Okay, but I'm saying we got people who don't believe like we do, because what they want to do is they say, okay, the Bible's kind of a cool book, but we don't really think that those writers wrote it, that those writers heard from God, and that's where they try to, they'll try to twist it down like that. But you have to look into these things. I had this for later on, but I think I'll do it now since it came up. Back in the 70s, okay, they had this thing where everybody was denying the Bible. Everybody was denying that the Bible was what it said that it was, that the miracles happened, that there was an actual great flood, that Jonah did live in the belly of a fish, and things like that. And the Missouri Synod totally split over it, along with other denominations. Anyway, the book, I should have brought it. Anyway, this book, it's called The Battle for the Bible. Okay. And it talks about all of these splits. The big one was in the Southern Baptist Convention. They'd just gone totally liberal on how to read the Bible. But Missouri Synod, are you familiar with it, Pastor? Yeah. Is that in the Missouri Synod, the battle over it was over miracles, like I say, the stories of creation, the flood, Jonah, and all. They had 50 professors at the seminary, at the St. Louis Seminary. And all this stuff was going on, getting taught wrong and stuff like that. And they asked for an oath of fidelity to the Bible or whatever it was. And people said no. The professors said no. 45 of the 50 professors left, walked out. More than half the students left and walked out. Went down the street, started their own seminary. Okay, but it wasn't unique to the Lutheran Church. Like I say, Southern Baptists went through it. You look at every denomination has a conservative wing and a liberal wing. In the Presbyterian Church of America, the PCA, they're the conservative wing. The PCUSA, they're the liberal wing. we have the LCMS, hang on just a second, Andy. We have the LCMS and we have the LCA. Episcopal Church has the same, whole Episcopal Church, you can say pretty much the Anglicans are the conservatives and the Episcopals are the liberal. But this was a big thing, and it's over those same questions as to how do we know? This sounds fanciful. We can't believe this. We can't teach this. And they do. What were you going to say, Andy?
Living in this church at that time, as already said it, we lost friends,
Oh,
neighbors,
yeah.
fellow workers that we admired and loved. And they just like shut the door and left.
Yeah.
Now, the Missouri Synod stayed as it was,
Pardon?
but the Missouri Synod stayed as it was. But the breakaway Synod, I think it was called,
Well, the Seminex at first. I mean, those were the people that started the thing. They're the ones who eventually worked their way down to 1989 that became the ELCA. But they gathered up the LCA, the ALC along the way, and they formed,
that was devastating to our church though.
lack of fidelity to the Bible is devastating to any church, because how do you know? If you don't, even if you don't know, you have to trust the people who've come along and said, this is the way that it is. One thing, like with the ELCA, and these churches can do what they want. I mean, these are battles I fought 40 years ago. I'm tired now. But like the ELCA, like their thing for having women pastors, okay? They didn't go away from the Bible to do that. I mean, because they know that Paul taught that women shouldn't be headship, have a headship over men in the church and stuff like that. But what they say is, well, yeah, but that's the way God spoke in Paul's time, but God speaks to us in a new way today. And voila, you have the women pastors. Voila, you have the gay and lesbian pastors, because they did the same thing with the gay and lesbians. They just said God's speaking in a different, in a different way today. And
Are they getting a vision?
pardon?
Are they getting a vision or a dream?
Well, that is a good thing. Who started it? And like I say, it's not just them, it's all these other, liberal wings of their own denominations. It's like, yeah, how did they get it, and how did they pass it along to make it sound like, yeah, this is the way God wants to do it today. God worked that way then, God works this way now. Okay, how do you know? And I don't know what their answer was, Ray.
Well, the reason I asked the question about the 5 books of Moses wrote, and because nobody had a Bible other than the church or
Right.
the synagogue or the temple. So a lot of it was done by memory. So these people memorized the 5 books of the Torah.
Right, it was an oral culture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't have internet back then.
Yeah.
Nothing to divert.
No, but what I've read from scholars that look into this stuff is they say that back then, because everything was an oral culture, that they trust oral culture more than they trust written down, accounts, because people made it their point to have it correct. When we did the first 11 chapters of Genesis a couple of years ago, we talked about the genealogies in the first like 5 chapters or whatever, in Genesis. Well, how did they work their way down to where we had it? Didn't the flood wipe everything out? And my answer anyway, because I stand here, no, my answer, was no. It got passed down from generation to generation to generation, and someone on the day of the flood handed it to someone and said, take this on the boat with you. Okay, because the people lived so long that they crossed over. That Seth, I can't remember it, that Seth, I think, knew Methuselah, or he knew Noah's father. I forget Noah's father's name. but when you overlap the years that they lived, so, Seth, he's right after Cain and Abel. So he would have been around when all these generations were done, and it gets passed down, and someone says, here, take these on the boat with you. And then when they get off, they still have it, then it gets passed down, and that
Or
makes,
he had it up here,
pardon?
or he had it up here.
Well, but what I'm saying is somebody had to have it, they got it on the boat. Got it on the, pardon? Remember, well, yeah, that's what Ray was saying, that it could have been memorized, We don't, see, here's the thing, everybody believes it until someone says, well, isn't it possible that it's this way instead of that way? And then people say, oh God, now I gotta think. And what's your answer gonna be? What's your answer gonna be? In a contingent universe, everything is possible except getting toothpaste back in the tube. I mean, anything's possible, but this is what the enemy does. Enemy keeps throwing up questions. Well, what about? Well, what about? What about? And then pardon?
Did God really say that?
Yeah, did God really? Oh, that was the serpent. Yeah, no, so that's a question, that we have. The Lowell pastor.
We, a couple of years ago, we saw the film, Is Genesis History.
Right, it's Genesis
Now,
history.
I don't know who produced that, but boy, they were so biblical.
Right. Except for to the people who say, well, we don't believe the Bible. I mean, we don't believe them. But anybody wants to watch a movie, I think we showed it here one Sunday, didn't we? One Sunday afternoon. It's called Is Genesis History, and it's a great movie. I mean, the guy, people that don't believe that kind of stuff don't believe the movie either. But he lays it out pretty good. He starts out the first 5 minutes of the movie. He's walking across, this rocky canyon land and, with trees and things like that. And he's talking about how it says how long it took how old the rocks are, how long it took to form these mountains and stuff. Turns out he's standing at the base of Mount St. Helen. He goes, these are only, 20 years at the time he did? Something like that. These rocks are only 20 years old. These canyons weren't even there. These mountains weren't, and that's his starting point. But anyway, it's called his Genesis history. Hour and 45 minutes.
But it's segmented, it's on YouTube.
Yeah, it's on YouTube. Yeah, it's on
It's
YouTube.
It's Genesis History.
Is Genesis, who said something out here?
I just said,
Oh.
it's really, really good. You want to see it. It really lays out an argument against the archaeological society that says it took millions and millions of years.
Yeah.
That explains it very well.
Yeah.
You said something a little earlier about the books of the Bible. And if you think about the fact that you've heard this before, but the 66 books of the Bible recorded by 40 different scribes. I don't say authors because God is the author, the men were scribes basically. Done in 3 different languages, on 3 different continents, and yet the entire continuity of the book remains unbroken, which is, there's no other piece of literature in existence in man's history that achieves that. None.
Yeah, no, it comes to the same conclusions. They all have the same theme, they all have the same conclusion. See, the challenge is and those were some pretty hefty topics that are in the Bible. But the challenge is say, well, in a room like this, where we have 20 people in here, if I gave you all a piece of paper and said, write down your thoughts on, and I give you a topic, like that, would everybody have the same thought? Would they even, if we said something like, what would be a good one? I don't know.
There'd be a common thread of continuity.
Yeah, would they even start, like if we said, well, write a paper about the automobile. Would everybody start with the same automobile? Would they end up with the same automobile? Would they even talk about the same people who created the automobile, because maybe instead of people talking about, um, Henry Ford or Mr. Cadillac or whoever, maybe they start with General Motors or, but if you talk about marriage, you know, tell me what society thinks of marriage. Well, so I'm just saying, so. I got Yeah. Anyways, look, the Bible's printed on the printing press in 1455 is when the printing press came out. The Bible was the first book to be printed with the Gutenberg printing press in 1445. The Bible is now printed on paper in many versions and languages. It's on recordings on the internet. It's all over the place. Here's our Bible for the day, the cell phone, but it's come in all of these different, different ways, so.
Gene,
Yeah, hang on just a second. Yeah.
so when, I just want to emphasize again the importance of having the Bible, why we believe that it is God's word from up to us today, that it's inerrant and infallible, and how these other churches Gene mentioned are, well, it's conservative and liberal often political terms, but churches will say that they're biblical. They believe some things from the Bible. But just two instances, I'll try to be brief with them. I was serving at a church in Pennsylvania, and a family went and moved, and there wasn't an LCMS church they could go to. So they went to a different Lutheran church. I got a call from the lady, and she said, my pastor just had a Bible study, and he said there wasn't really a flood. Where did that come from? I said, well, first you have to talk to your pastor. But, it depends what you believe about the Bible. Is the flood just a nice story that people got punished, but it didn't really happen? Or do we believe that it's true? The other one is, when I first became a pastor 20 years ago, some ELCA pastors from my area wanted to meet with Missouri Synod pastors and leaders, and they wanted to switch over because they didn't like the way their denomination was going. And the one pastor said he was at a pastor's conference, I think it was. He said they're standing around drinking coffee, 6 in a circle. He said he's the only one out of the group that believed in the virgin birth of Jesus. Yep. So this isn't just little stuff that they're not believing. This is, the birth of Christ, that then you get into, evolution. Is the Genesis chapter 1 and 2 true? And people just pick and choose what they want. And, God gave us the whole thing, and not that it's just a nice warm and fuzzy story for us, but, real stuff, a real savior. Yeah, and that's where the starting thing is. I don't think that I don't think that people start denying the Bible because they're reading the Bible. I think they start to deny things because they talk to other people, and I think that's what those pastors have said, that they don't believe in the virgin birth. They can't get that from reading the Bible. They can't even read the Bible and say, well, maybe that's a fantasy, because I don't think people go that far. But when they start talking to each other, that's where.
Well, I think it also starts at a deeper level. What pastor's describing to me, I call smorgasbord Christianity. You go down the smorgasbord and you pick the food you like. People do that with the Bible. They go through the Bible and they pick the things they like. And what I mean by going deeper, Gene, is the things that indict them in their lifestyle.
Yep.
They want to reject because, I don't want to change my lifestyle. I like my sinning nature. And so therefore they deny it.
Yeah, no, it's really tough. And that's why those, we've talked about them a couple of times, maybe more in Masters Men than here. But these surveys that like the Pew Report does and the other people, I forget which one's at Arizona Christian University. That may be Pew that's there. But anyway, they do these surveys of the general people, of Christians. and people who self-identify as Christians, let's put it that way. And they like say they don't believe in the virgin birth. They don't believe that the Bible is actually from, I mean, the basic things they just deny, but they're all part of this Christian culture where they feel comfortable, just like that. So I call myself a Christian because that's what happens when you have these self-identified Christians is what are they actually, I mean, and I usually trust people. If somebody's going to say I'm a Christian, I'll go with it until I find out, different. Nick had his hand up. Yell real loud.
But it seems like it's always kind of been like that, like historically, like there's always been. Like Luther, like his huge issue with a lot of the pastors was like the people were uneducated and lacked like basic.
But there they were uneducated. I mean, and he says so in the introduction to the preface to the catechism. He says, something like they're dumb as oxes, and he's talking about the pastors,
Yeah, and that was like an accusation against the Lutherans when the Lutheran Church was taking over. Is a lot of guys would be like a brewmaster, then become a pastor for 2 years, and then go back to being and kind of floating in and out. So it seems like it's always been kind of like chaotic.
Yeah.
Church.
But it's easier to deny, especially when you're in a crowd. Surely you don't believe. No, I don't. I mean, I'm not one of those radical Christians. I'm not absolutely crazy yet, but Ray.
Well, again, I've been diving and I wanted to find out who all was present when they put the Bible together to come up with 66 books, and what criteria did they use to say this one's in, this one's out? Would they vote on it, yes or no? Was it my majority wins? And what criteria did they use? And it said that they used youth in worship, the language and consistency as far as the Jewish faith, and then prophetic origin. So that was what Sept said was the criteria that they used to put the Old Testament or the Torah together. So is that accurate? Or?
Well, I mean, it's accurate. The idea is that these people didn't just sit down and say, okay, look, we got to put a Bible in. We have a publisher that's waiting for us and we're late in getting it to press, so let's pick and choose. It's not that way. It goes back to that inspiration thing. Get out your chart. Open the chart. We get into that. We talked on box. We talked on it's on the back side of one of those pages. So we talked last week about one of the boxes when we were talking about revelation. Okay, we were talking about general revelation and special revelation, but it says began as thoughts in God's mind. Okay, so the Bible God's revelation starts in God's mind and gets sent to, it's revealed to whoever the human authors are. Okay, so God communicates his truth to mankind through chosen individuals. Now, we don't know the exact way that he communicated, to them. I mean, Moses would be walking along and he runs into God in a burning bush. So it's just a series of those kinds of things. God calls him up on the mountain and tells him to hold 10 commandments. Then when he breaks the 10 commandments, he's got to go back. God writes it with his own finger, on the stones. So however he does it, God, he communicates his, his revelation. So then the next box says it came to human authors' minds. Okay, and that's a tough one, because how much came to their minds? Did all of God's mind transfer into their minds? Part of God's mind transferred into. Well, it's strange because when you read the scriptures in Deuteronomy 29, It says the secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things that are revealed belong to us and to our children forever. Okay, so God's got secrets that he hasn't told us, or at least what's called the secret things of his mind. Okay, he hasn't told us, but what he has told us has been revealed to us, and it's for our benefit. Okay, but Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, he says, "For who has understood the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him?" Anybody here understand God well enough to instruct God? Why not? He gave you your mind. He gave you his mind, because the next phrase in there is, "But we have the mind of Christ." What the heck is Paul talking about? So, and we don't know. I mean, he's just saying we don't have enough to instruct God, but we do have the mind of Christ. I think what he's saying is we have enough to move forward. Okay, that's what's been transmitted down through Revelation. So the next box goes over to inspiration. So these same guys wrote the original manuscripts of the Bible. That God, you remember we used that term last week, God superintends over, God's watching over, God's making sure that it's being done his way. So however God is revealing and inspiring, he's keeping these guys in control. Like Joe said, you have 40 authors or 40 scribes, 40 kings and farmers and whoever they were who have this revelation for God, who have the inspiration of God to carry out whatever it took to write these books, write these books down. This will be the part that gets to what Ray wants here. That line that goes down says canonicity. The canon is just the accepted books. Okay, it's just an old Latin kind of a term. I mean, it's a normal term that's used in other parts of life. It sounds holy when we say the canon. But so the early church recognizes and affirms which writings are divinely inspired. God's inspiring them to know, which are the inspired books. Yeah. They discover it. They don't get to choose. They're not creating it. Okay. And when it came down to when they finally decided all the books, they didn't decide, they voted, they didn't vote it. They recognized that no, these are the 27 books that God has handed down. Okay. We don't know how they did it. I mean,
Well, even some of the books though were rejected to begin with, but then later on there were, I don't know, maybe had a revote on it, or maybe they just debated over them. And said,
the books weren't, well, no, the books weren't rejected. They weren't recognized at the time. It's kind of like this process that they go through. That's why I got the other sheet there. That's Luther's Bible, because Luther is sometime after a lot of these books are already accepted in the scriptures, but we'll see the trouble that he had in deciding. I mean, here he's a pretty holy guy, but he's not an infallible guy, and he comes up with a different Bible. Our leader had a different Bible.
he didn't care for James.
No, but he's got reasons, because nobody cared for James.
Yeah.
At the time. But anyway, let's move on. It's just the idea that they recognized what God had delivered. Okay. So then the church collected the 66 books. Okay. Now again, we have 73 books in the Catholic Bible. We have like 80 books in the Eastern Orthodox Bible. What do we do with that? And they came before the Protestant Bibles. The thing is that, and this is all that we can walk away with, is people have worked on this, so it's not like an unknown factor. And people have made their studies available as to why they include or why it's why it's not included. I mean, you gotta remember the Eastern Church, the church used to be one church. Okay, it was just one church. You had a Western faction and an Eastern faction, but it was just one church until they split. And the Eastern Orthodox have, I don't know at what point, I'd have to go back and find, because it's the council of somebody in the 380s where they finally said, look, this is it. This is our Bible. I just don't remember what they included in it. Right? Because you remember, I said this last week or 2 weeks ago, the Eastern Orthodox Bible has extra books written within the books. Daniel has 2 extra chapters, chapter 13, chapter 14, that we don't have in our Bibles. They have extra sections of writings in some of the, books. When the prayer of the 3 lads who were put in the fire, before they got thrown in. In our Bible, it's like maybe 2 verses, the prayer, and it's like 40 verses in the Eastern, Bible. So
Where does that come from?
what's that?
Where does that come?
Well, they would say it came from God. They wrote theirs before we got ours.
Different God, or God blessing them by giving them more.
Well, God hasn't cursed them for it, so I don't know. I'm just pointing this out, that it goes through this transmission. It goes through all of these steps here and comes out, and we make the best we can of it. Because we've got, so we got that where it says textual criticism. That's the transmission of the Bible. How did this stuff move along? The process of copying and preserving the original manuscripts across generations. Somebody had the original manuscripts. So somebody made a copy of the original manuscripts, and the original manuscript's gone. And then somebody's got a copy of that and a copy of that. Are there errors in the Bible? Who said no? Oh, no. There are errors in the Bible, in our Bible. There's variants and errors in these Bibles because we don't have the originals. Because all you have to do is open a Bible and you'll see differences between, say, this Bible and your
Translation?
no, they're called variances. Most of the variances don't mean anything. Something like 98% of the variants that they find in the scriptures don't mean anything. It could be punctuation, it could be spelling, it could be phrasing. If a phrase says, our Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, versus saying the Lord Jesus Christ, our Savior, when they're copying, like that. Those kinds of errors. But what we say when we say there's no mistakes from God in the original manuscripts, which we don't have. So people study these things. People count the variances. But the thing is, we know what the variances are. So you can go back and check. So I have you guys all copy. I'm going to have you all copy Genesis chapter 1. Okay? So I'm going to give you a Bible, give you all the same Bible, and say, copy this. You're all going to copy it. And then hand it to the person next to you and have them correct it. Because chances are when they're copying it, you're going to skip a word. Sometimes people skip a line, while they're trying to copy. But we have a manuscript, say the Bible there, or if I wrote it out, say I write it out, I make sure it's perfect, and I make up copies for all of you and tell you to copy that. Okay, even though you're making mistakes and you're all making mistakes in the different areas, we all have my copy that was correct. Some of yours may be correct also. Okay, but that's the way it gets transferred. You got to remember, all these people are just copying and copying and copying, and it's going to happen. Sometimes there's marginal notes in the margin that someone makes that gets included in the chapter, 8th chapter of John, the end of the 7th chapter, the beginning of the 8th chapter of John, the woman caught in adultery. If you look at yours, it's probably bracketed, and probably has a translational note in there that says, this isn't found in, the most accurate copies, or however they word it there. They're just telling you, we don't find it in the original or the oldest manuscripts that we have. Mark, the ending of Mark 16, I think it's 9 through 20. Okay. They have a notation and they say these aren't in the original or the best manuscripts that we have. But see, what I'm saying is, if there are mistakes, we know where all the mistakes are. But those aren't God's mistakes. Those are people's mistakes. That make sense? They had a big thing at the Concordia with their commentary series. They got these big blue commentary books and books of the Bible, and they come out, like 3 of them a year. I had to stop about number 10. I heard the 10th one. They got too expensive. They're $70 a piece nowadays. Anyway, so the guy who was writing the commentary on Mark, okay, he wouldn't write a commentary on chapter 16, verses 9 through 20. He said, I'm done. Like, you can't do that. I'm done. I don't think that they belong there. So they had to get somebody else to finish the commentary.
So they weren't originally there. Where'd they come from?
Well, here's what they say. And this is why, no, this is,
Bible says that in there.
says what?
That this was not part of the original manuscript.
Yeah.
Well, then where did it come from?
What they say is that someone probably added it in because Mark doesn't cover the resurrection the way that the other Bible writers do. Okay, it kind of ends with, and the women went to town crying, or whatever it says, like that. It does say right above that, though, that Jesus, the gardener, had said, if you're looking for him, he's not here, he is risen. So we know that Mark knew about the resurrection, but anyway, I'm sure there's a whole bunch of theories. Now, it could also be that in the originals, it was there and somehow got taken out. Nobody knows these things. Okay, what actually happened, nobody knows, so we have to speculate. So if we have really good, and there is a difference in the manuscripts, okay, between the received, the received manuscripts, the Alexandrian manuscripts. I don't remember which are which, okay? The point that I'm just trying to make is that because you're going to hear all these things, but you just have to realize that through the process of the chart, all these things have been looked into. There's no surprises in there, that people have looked into it and they know, yeah, because see, like Ray said, you might be reading along in your Bible and you come across that note. And the note is in the text, right?
No, it's above the text.
Huh?
Well,
It's above the text, right? No, I'm just saying, so you can't miss it. It's not like you find something at the bottom in some translator's note.
Right.
So what do you do when you're reading that and it's like, boom? And like I say, John chapter 7, I think it's starting at 53, it's the same way with the woman caught in adultery. But the thing is, we know all those. Okay. And whether it's in there or not doesn't change anything. Doesn't change anything. None of the little variants in the Bible amount to any doctrinal error. The same thing is, when you hear those things, you got to go, what do I think? Who would have had, right?
Well, didn't Luther have the word alone?
Well, that's another that's another thing like that. But yeah, that what Ray's talking about, I forget, Galatians, where it talked about faith, talked about by faith, and Luther added the word alone, by faith alone. So that's a big argument between Protestants and Roman Catholics, like that. Now his thing was that he was translating into German. And the German was a very small language. In fact, they say like Luther probably invented a third of the German language. just by having to translate the Bible because they didn't have words. So that's another thing. I mean, what do you do when you go to a place that doesn't have words and you have to make up a word that somebody's going to come and bite you in the butt later on about your choice of words, so Pastor.
Sometimes when people were copying, they may try to correct something that they think that another copyist
Right.
had done wrongly. And sometimes it may be something that doesn't sound right about God or something like that. And so often when they're looking at, and these aren't defining books of the Bible, they're finding fragments of old, deteriorating papyrus and stuff. And so usually when they try to figure out what's the original or the earliest one, usually it's the one that's hardest reading, the one that doesn't try to correct God or something, because people try to gloss things over. And just the other thing with these bracketed parts of the Bible that have just become the norm. Like most of us will tell that story about the lady caught in adultery, or Easter when Mark's gospel.
Right.
We may talk about the ending, but that's not part of our regular Easter reading. But when we think of the Lord's Prayer, that part that's tacked on at the end, for thine is the kingdom and the power, we just accept that that's part of the Lord's Prayer. But that's not in the Bible as part of the Lord's Prayer.
Anybody ever been to a Catholic church while they say the Lord's Prayer?
Yeah.
We were at a wedding. My niece was getting married. She was marrying a Catholic guy. So all us Protestants are on one side and all the Catholics are on the other side. But that's the way you do it. And I'll stand and say Lord's Prayer and get to their end. Everybody shuts up and we keep going and you go. So
sometimes the churches do continue to afford it, and some churches may have continued with that, and then it became kind of the de facto, this is part of our Bible.
Yeah. So okay, so we got that far. The translations, that's another thing. They get translated in languages. They come down in Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic, but the people had to write that down. So then it gets translated from that into modern English. And again, like I said, the King James Bible. See, the King James Bible came from a family of manuscripts that at the time were the go-to manuscripts, until they dig up and they find better manuscripts. Because their manuscripts, say they had 100 manuscripts and they're trying to piece it together and they do their translation. Then all of a sudden, in those 400 years, you get another 200 manuscripts found, but they're better manuscripts. They're earlier manuscripts than the ones that King James, used. And so that's where you get into doing that.
Yeah, you get into exegesis, which is trying to figure out what the actual application of the word was at the time.
Right.
Because words change in their meaning. And I can give you an example in the modern language. If you say something is bad, what does that mean to you? It's not good, right? No, hey, I'm bad. That means I'm good.
Or another one, bombs.
Yeah. Hey, so what did that word mean in ancient Greek, ancient Aramaic at the time? So you got to look at now other literature of the period to see.
Well, that's what they do in translations. And I've got an example here. Is in Acts 28:13. Paul said, remember, they're getting ready to leave from one location to another. They're on the boat. And it says, and from thence, we fetched a compass and came to Regum. What's this compass that they fetched? There's no compasses back then. So what does the word mean? Like that. So what it means is it's like a circuit course. We chose the course we're going to take and going around the shoreline. So like the ESV will say, and from there we made a circuit and arrived at that place. I like it's called the Common English Bible. We'll finish with this. It just says from there we sailed to Brigham. Yeah, but see, that's what people do with all these translations. So now, I said that was the end. I just wanted to do this one. Translations are written at different grade levels. King James is written at a 12th grade reading level. Okay. Well, I guess maybe in Elizabethan England it was. New International Version, who's got the NIV here? Okay, it's written around 7th to 8th grade level. The English Standard Version, it's ours here.
I thought NIV stood for non-inscribable.
Anyway, this 10th grade reading level. Let's see, the New Living Translation. We had one of those here. Anyway, is the 6th grade level. See, people say the Bible's too hard to read. I guess we don't read enough. The New American Standard Bible, that's the one I usually carry around. That's 11th grade level. And the Message, that's Deacon Dennis's Bible, is a 5th to 6th grade level. Okay. So it's not like the Bibles are written like for professors only, like that. I mean, so what I'm saying is that goes with the way that you translate. So when somebody says, we're going to start this new translation committee, that we want it to be at a higher level, a lower reading level, who's your targeted audience. So, okay, well, I'll tell you what, let's see, the one that goes down talks about illumination and interpretation. It says God's thoughts in our minds. That's what gets into our mind. Okay. It's been illuminated, it's been interpreted, whether it's interpreted by us or somebody for us, it gets into our mind. And that's where I was going to bring up that battle for the Bible thing about the different denominations denying things. Is because it may have been illuminated, but was misinterpreted by the time it got to it. And then it says application is the changes in our lives that the Bible makes, which it should. And then the last one is communications, and that's where we communicate the Bible, to others. Next week, we'll look at Luther's Bible, because I think it's telling as to how hard it is to make determinations, but they do it because somehow we've got the Bible that all of Protestant, at least all the Protestants have, like that. I mean, that it's gotten down to, that. Anyway. Oh, law.
Locus Antilegomena.
Huh? Antilegomena. We'll get to that, but those are Bibles that he denied. And
I gathered that.
yeah, but he's got 4 that he relegated, but there's 7 total because the church was having trouble with 7 books. Are they actual? You have to add to those, besides what's on the Luther list, you have to add 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John also. Like that the whole church was, they were just confused by it. Were these actual Bible worthy books? So, and we don't have to do the work. Don't think you have to go home and say, well, I'm going to research 2 Peter, and I will determine for myself if it is. Yeah, but whether I want to read it or not. So, okay, let me get rid of that. Howard, you okay there? Linda, you okay there? Did you hear halfway decent? Oh, yeah, I can't hear you. Yeah, let me do this. I gotta